Hello everyone, my name is Tal, and this is Diligence. A few days ago, I revisited Matt Dillahunty's debate with Dr. Mike Licona about Jesus' resurrection. There is a ton to be said about it, but there was one thing in particular that grabbed my attention.
I gave you that example of the beheading. I'm beheaded up here, everybody's out of the auditorium, you've already seen my headless corpse. I come walking out an hour later and you all see me alive, and I testify that I met someone in heaven and they shared with me a private conversation that they had with you that you know is correct. Now, wouldn't our understanding that that is impossible by natural causes, wouldn't that justify you to infer that a supernatural event has indeed occurred?
You don't have justification to call it supernatural. What you're expressing there is a discomfort with saying, I don't know what the explanation is.
If someone was beheaded like I'm given, and you were still unwilling to say supernatural, then, Matt, I think the problem is your epistemology there. I don't think there's anything practically that could convince you.
I think the problem is your epistemology there.
What Mike seems to be saying is that under Matt's epistemology, some things can never be determined to be true, even if they are. I think Matt would probably agree with that. I know I certainly do. But it seems that Mike says that it's a problem, and this is where I hold a different position. I mean, it is a problem, for sure. An epistemological framework is better the more true facts it lets us affirm. And there might be some true facts that could never be affirmed under Matt's. That much is true, but then there's the other side of the coin. An epistemological framework is better the less false facts it lets us affirm. As Matt himself often says, I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as I can. If we only cared about affirming as many true facts as we can, then we would just affirm everything. There would be zero facts about the world that we would reject, but that also means that we wouldn't reject any false facts. We would affirm all of them, and I don't think anyone would call that good epistemology. It's a matter of balance. It's about how sensitive your test is. How many false positives are you willing to accept to prevent false negatives, and vice versa. And I think that Matt's been more than clear about where he stands on this. The time to believe something is when there is evidence for it. He's acknowledged time and again that means that there will be false negatives, facts that he doesn't accept as true even though they are. But that this is still better than the alternative, to accept every fact as true until there's evidence that it's false, which would necessarily lead to false positives, accepting facts that aren't true as true. And not only that, it would necessarily lead to accepting mutually exclusive facts. I'd also add that on numbers alone, there's an advantage to the epistemology that Matt presents here, as the number of false negatives remains limited, whereas the number of false positives under the alternative epistemology is practically limitless. So, while it's true that Matt's epistemology suffers from a problem, namely that he necessarily ends up tentatively rejecting some truths, it still remains far better than any other epistemology under which we would accept a far greater number of falsehoods, many of which contradict each other. The thing is, I don't think that Dr. Licona is advocating for an epistemology that affirms unverified claims. I believe he thinks that his example does provide verification to the claim that the supernatural exists, and that somehow Matt's epistemology is just biased against the supernatural. So let's see if Dr. Licona's example actually gives us any evidence for the supernatural. He presents a hypothetical case where the facts definitely don't seem to match up with what we know about the natural world. In this hypothetical scenario, we should definitely be convinced that we were wrong about something. Specifically, that beheaded people don't come back to life with their heads attached, and that no one knows of a specific conversation we once had with a person who'd since died.
If this happened, would you then accept that there's a supernatural explanation? And the short answer is no. What I would accept is that the null hypothesis that people's heads don't come back on, that's clearly disproved. I'm not precluding the supernatural. There needs to be a demonstration that this is the cause. What I'm specifically addressing is that I don't get to call that supernatural. What it would be is there's something new and weird and undiscovered and unknown.
I can see the emotional appeal of jumping to the conclusion that these two facts should have one explanation, and that explanation should be supernatural. But what I don't see is something other than the emotional appeal. What I don't see is any kind of evidence that is indeed the case. I can think of many natural explanations for a situation like this. Some might even be more plausible than a supernatural one. But even if none were more plausible, or even if I couldn't think of any alternative explanation, that still doesn't constitute evidence for the supernatural. An unexplained phenomenon is not evidence of anything other than there being a phenomenon that is not explained. To suggest otherwise is the definition of an argument from ignorance. I don't know, therefore X. No, there is no good reason for you to jump to that latter part. Just try to feel comfortable with the I don't know. You have no justification to go any further. But what if the supernatural does exist, but can never be demonstrated or evidenced directly? What if the only way to know it exists is to infer it from things that seem to contradict what we know about the natural? Like I said, that is a problem with Matt's epistemology, but there is no good solution to this problem.
There are people who immediately object, saying, "Oh, that's a cheat because you can't identify this, you can't confirm the supernatural." Yes, that's the problem.
I haven't seen any suggestion of an epistemological framework that allows us to confirm unevidenced things without leading to accepting nearly every preposition. Dr. Licona sure hasn't presented any such framework here. To illustrate, let's take his example and explore two explanations for it. Maybe it was his God who raised him from the dead, head back on and all, and during his time away, a dead relative of Matt's told him about that conversation. This would be a sufficient explanation, but like we said, there's no evidence for it. Or maybe none of it actually happened. Maybe Mike can just manipulate people's minds. He has this contraption that can make everyone in the auditorium believe that they saw him being beheaded and die. He used that same gadget also to make Matt remember the conversation with a relative, even though that conversation never actually happened. Maybe that relative never actually existed. This too would be a sufficient explanation, but again, no evidence. There's no way that both these explanations are correct, right? But if we're okay with accepting explanations for things we don't understand without any evidence for the explanation itself, we must accept both of them. Or Mike has to explain why it's okay to jump to the supernatural and not to the mind-bending gadget. As it stands, Matt's epistemology has the problem of not being able to confirm every true fact about the universe, only those that have been sufficiently demonstrated. And Dr. Licona's epistemology has the problem of being forced to hold to mutually exclusive ideas, or, at best, to arbitrarily reject some of them. Which epistemology is more problematic is for each of us to decide, though we can certainly try to discuss it. To me anyway, the answer seems fairly obvious. Just one remark on Dr. Licona's argument itself. Even if he would have demonstrated his point that there's strong empirical data that suggests a supernatural component to reality, which he didn't, and even if he would have proven that there's strong historical data that suggests that Jesus was resurrected, which he also didn't, his argument still fails. In a nutshell, this is a debate about whether or not Jesus was resurrected. And Dr. Licona says that the existence of a supernatural component means that resurrection is possible, and that if it is possible, it's probably the best explanation for the historical claims of resurrection. But proving the supernatural doesn't prove that it's possible to resurrect people. Not any more than proving the natural proves that it's impossible. You can't say people have had near-death experiences, therefore resurrection is possible. It simply doesn't follow. As always, I'm very interested to get your take. Which epistemological framework sounds better to you? Do you have another suggestion for better epistemology? Do you think I misrepresented Dr. Licona's point in any way? The comment section below awaits you. And if you liked this video or found it interesting, then the like, subscribe and share buttons await you. And so do the links that will be up on your screen in a few seconds. Thank you all very much for watching, and remember, our world is complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Have a good 2021.